Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The world will always notice the mud on your shoes before it notices the courage in your heart, unless one person is wise enough to look deeper. The towering glass headquarters of Whitaker Global shimmered beneath the gray Chicago morning, every polished window reflecting a city already rushing toward another workday. Luxury sedans glided beneath the covered entrance. Men and women in tailored suits hurried across spotless marble floors with steaming coffee cups in hand, their confident footsteps echoing through the elegant lobby. Everything about the building whispered success, precision, and perfection. Then the revolving door slowed, and every conversation seemed to pause for a heartbeat. A young woman stepped inside, her navy blazer streaked with dried mud, her skirt splattered along one side, her brown leather flats soaked from ankle to toe. Damp strands of chestnut hair clung to her cheeks, and tiny drops of rain still slid from the edge of her sleeve onto the polished floor. Elena Marlowe stopped just inside the entrance, drawing one careful breath as dozens of curious eyes settled on her. She knew exactly what they saw. They saw someone who did not belong. They saw stained clothes instead of determination. They saw muddy shoes instead of sacrifice. They saw embarrassment where she carried quiet conviction. She tightened her grip on the worn leather portfolio pressed against her chest. Inside it rested her resume, now slightly wrinkled from the morning rain, and a recommendation letter whose corner had blurred after getting soaked. It had taken months to earn that letter. She silently prayed it would still be readable. A security guard glanced toward the reception desk before approaching her with polite hesitation. "Ma'am, are you here for maintenance?" Elena offered a tired but genuine smile. "Actually, I'm here for my 10 o'clock interview." The guard blinked, clearly surprised, then politely pointed toward the elevators. Before she could thank him, soft laughter drifted across the lobby. Two applicants dressed in flawless business suits exchanged amused glances. One leaned toward the other and whispered just loudly enough to be heard. "Looks like somebody got lost on a farm." Another quietly chuckled. "Maybe the interview is for landscaping." Elena lowered her eyes for only a second. The comments stung, but they were not the hardest part of her morning. 45 minutes earlier, she had been driving an aging compact sedan across a rain-soaked county road outside the city when traffic suddenly slowed. Most drivers impatiently switched lanes and continued toward downtown, unwilling to lose another minute. Elena had noticed an elderly man standing beside a bicycle that had slipped into a muddy drainage ditch after the front tire caught the edge of the wet shoulder. He had struggled to pull it free while rain poured harder by the minute. She had looked at the glowing clock on her dashboard. If she stopped, she would almost certainly arrive late. If she kept driving, she would probably make the interview looking presentable. For a brief moment, she had wrestled with the choice everyone faces when kindness competes with personal ambition. Then she had parked on the shoulder without another thought. The mud reached halfway to her calves before she reached him. Together, they lifted the bicycle back onto solid pavement. She used the only clean handkerchief she carried to wipe dirt from the man's trembling hands before making sure he was steady enough to continue. He thanked her several times, apologizing that she had ruined her clothes. Elena had simply smiled and answered, "Clothes can be washed. Regret lasts longer." Now, standing inside Whitaker Global, she wondered if those words had cost her the future she desperately needed. Her savings account held barely enough to cover groceries for the week. Rent was due in 5 days. Hospital invoices for her mother's ongoing treatments sat unopened on the kitchen table because she already knew what each envelope contained. This interview was more than an opportunity. It was the narrow bridge between hope and another season of impossible choices. At the reception desk, a sharply dressed coordinator looked Elena up and down before forcing a professional smile. "Miss Marlowe." Elena nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The woman hesitated. "The executive hiring panel is rather formal. You may want to reschedule after cleaning up." Elena glanced down at the drying mud covering her jacket. For just an instant, doubt crept into her heart. Maybe she should leave. Maybe first impressions mattered too much. Maybe kindness had been a luxury she could no longer afford. Then she slowly lifted her head. Her voice remained gentle, almost apologetic, yet every word carried quiet strength. If I had arrived clean because I drove past someone who needed help, I don't think I deserve this job anyway. Silence settled across the lobby. Even the applicants who had been laughing moments earlier stopped speaking. None of them noticed the tall man standing near the far window, dressed in a simple charcoal shirt without a tie, holding an ordinary employee badge clipped casually to his belt. He had been observing the morning interviews long before anyone arrived. His name was Callum Whitaker, billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Whitaker Global, though no one around Elena had recognized him. He wasn't watching the mud on her clothes anymore. He wasn't even looking at her resume. He was listening to one sentence that echoed far louder than the polished lobby ever could. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, it was the first interview answer he had truly believed in years. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and Elena Marlowe stepped onto the 32nd floor feeling every dried patch of mud growing heavier against her clothes. Plush carpeting muted every footstep, while floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Chicago skyline stretching for miles beneath a blanket of fading rain clouds. Everything looked expensive enough to intimidate someone who had spent the last 3 years counting every grocery receipt before reaching the checkout counter. A young assistant greeted the applicants with a practiced smile and handed each person a visitor badge. When she reached Elena, her smile hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before returning. Elena noticed it, but pretended she did not. She clipped the badge onto her jacket anyway. The waiting room resembled a luxury hotel lounge more than an interview area. Fresh flowers stood beside modern artwork. Soft, instrumental music drifted through hidden speakers. Every applicant sat perfectly dressed, reviewing portfolios or rehearsing polished answers under their breath. Elena quietly chose the chair nearest the window, hoping not to attract more attention than she already had. She carefully opened her worn portfolio and checked her recommendation letter again. The ink had spread slightly where rainwater had soaked through the paper, but the signature remained visible. She smiled faintly. That was enough. Across the room, whispers floated once again. One applicant leaned toward another. There is no way she makes it past the first question. Another replied. Human resources will probably send her home before she even sits down. Elena heard every word. She simply folded the letter, placed it back inside the portfolio, and rested both hands on top of it. Her grandmother had often told her, people reveal more about themselves than about you when they decide to judge you. Remembering those words steadied her breathing. A few minutes later, the assistant appeared again. Miss Marlowe, the hiring committee is ready for you. Elena stood, smoothed the wrinkles from her jacket as best she could, and followed her down a long hallway lined with photographs celebrating Whitaker Global's history. Every picture displayed innovation, awards, charitable projects, and smiling employees. She wondered whether those smiles had been earned or simply photographed. Inside the conference room, 3 executives waited behind a polished walnut table. Their expressions remained courteous but reserved. Elena thanked them for the opportunity before taking her seat. One executive reviewed her resume in silence. Another glanced briefly at her shoes before looking back at the paperwork. The third, a woman named Monica Voss, Director of Human Resources, folded her hands together and spoke first. Miss Marlowe, before we discuss your qualifications, I have to ask something. Obvious. Did something happen this morning? Elena nodded honestly. Yes, ma'am. Monica raised one eyebrow. Most candidates would have called to reschedule. Elena answered calmly. I considered it. Then why did you not? Elena looked at each interviewer before replying. Because I made a choice that delayed me, but I do not regret making it. Monica waited. Explain. Elena took a slow breath. An older gentleman needed help after his bicycle slid into a muddy ditch during the storm. Other cars kept driving. I stopped. One executive quietly leaned back in his chair. Monica remained expressionless, and helping him seemed more important than arriving prepared for the biggest interview of your career. Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled with quiet humility. I believe the interview would measure my character as much as my resume. If I arrived perfectly clean by ignoring someone who needed help, then my appearance would have been dishonest. Silence settled over the room. Monica tapped a pen lightly against her notebook. Idealism is admirable, Miss Marlowe. Business is different. Business requires priorities. Elena nodded respectfully. I agree, but I also believe priorities reveal values. Skills can be improved. Integrity is much harder to teach. Behind the dark glass observation window overlooking the conference room, Callum Whitaker stood unnoticed with his hands resting loosely in his pockets. He had watched hundreds of interviews over the years, and nearly every applicant eventually said exactly what they believed executives wanted to hear. Elena was different. She never tried to impress anyone. She simply answered as though the truth was enough. For reasons he could not explain, he found himself hoping no one in that room would mistake sincerity for weakness. Monica closed the resume and exchanged brief glances with the other executives before asking another question. Suppose a customer makes an unfair decision about you based only on appearances. How would you respond? Elena looked down at the dried mud still clinging to her sleeve before lifting her eyes again. I cannot control first impressions. I can only control the second impression they leave with after they know me. Through the observation glass, Callum felt the corners of his mouth lift into the faintest smile. It was a simple answer, yet somehow it carried more confidence than speeches he had heard from executives earning seven-figure salaries. For the first time in a very long while, he was no longer interested in whether a candidate could strengthen his company. He was beginning to wonder whether someone like Elena Marlowe could quietly strengthen the people inside it. Monica Voss slowly closed her notebook and offered the kind of professional smile that revealed nothing. Thank you, Miss Marlowe. We have no further questions at the moment. Someone will contact you after we complete the remaining interviews. Elena stood, thanked each member of the panel, gathered her weathered portfolio, and quietly left the conference room without asking how she had performed. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, leaving the executives in thoughtful silence. One senior manager leaned back in his chair. She has impressive references despite limited experience. Another nodded. She communicates well under pressure. Monica remained unconvinced. She also arrived looking completely unprepared. Our clients expect professionalism before they ever hear a single word. Behind the observation glass, Callum Whitaker listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that the most revealing conversations happened after candidates walked away. Numbers could be measured. Talent could be developed. Character only revealed itself when nobody believed it was being evaluated. Monica gathered the resumes into two neat stacks before speaking again. First impressions matter because they reflect judgment. If she could not protect her own opportunity, how will she protect the company's reputation? Callum finally stepped away from the glass, saying nothing, but her question lingered in his mind. Reputation. It was a word he had heard thousands of times inside boardrooms. Yet somehow it felt strangely empty compared to the quiet conviction he had just witnessed. Downstairs, Elena stepped back into the executive waiting area and released a slow breath she had been holding since entering the building. She had no idea whether she had impressed anyone. She only knew she had answered honestly. Sitting beside the window once again, she reached into her portfolio and carefully unfolded the rain-damaged recommendation letter. The paper was soft around the edges now, but the signature remained clear enough to read. She smiled gently before placing it back inside. Then she reached into her coat pocket and found the small white handkerchief she had used earlier that morning. Dried streaks of mud still marked one corner. She considered throwing it away when she noticed faint blue embroidery stitched into the fabric. The initials A.W. were sewn carefully near the edge. She frowned slightly. She had been in such a hurry helping the elderly cyclist that she had completely forgotten the handkerchief did not belong to her. I guess I should have returned this, she whispered to herself. She folded it neatly instead of discarding it, and slipped it safely into her portfolio beside the recommendation letter. Across the lobby, Callum entered through a side hallway wearing the same simple charcoal shirt, still looking every bit like an ordinary operations employee. He deliberately removed the executive access badge from his pocket before walking toward the coffee station. He was not planning to introduce himself. He simply wanted one conversation without titles getting in the way. As he filled two paper cups with fresh coffee, he glanced toward Elena. She was staring quietly through the enormous windows at the rain beginning to slow outside. There was no frustration on her face, no bitterness, only quiet exhaustion. She looked like someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to several people instead of one young woman. Callum picked up both cups and walked over. Long morning, he asked with an easy smile. Elena looked up, slightly surprised. You could say that. He offered one of the coffees. I made two by accident. She laughed softly. That is either very generous or very convenient. Maybe both. She accepted the cup with genuine gratitude. Thank you. They stood near the window for a moment, watching raindrops slide down the glass. Interview. Callum asked casually. Elena nodded. Yes. How do you think it went? She shrugged with an honest smile. I have absolutely no idea. You do not seem nervous anymore. She looked down at the coffee before answering. Once you tell the truth, there is not much left to worry about. Either people value it, or they do not. Callum studied her quietly. Most applicants spent interviews trying to become the person they thought employers wanted. Elena seemed content being exactly who she already was. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. If they decide not to hire you, will you regret stopping to help that man this morning? Elena answered so quickly that it felt almost instinctive. No, not even a little. She shook her head. Jobs come and go. I would have remembered driving away for the rest of my life. Those simple words settled deeply inside Callum. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning whether the company he had built had become too focused on polished appearances and not focused enough on people like the woman standing beside him, holding a paper cup with muddy shoes and unwavering principles. Neither of them noticed that several floors above, Monica Voss had already begun making a decision that would send both their lives in a direction neither could possibly imagine. After finishing the coffee, Elena thanked the friendly employee she knew only as Cal and walked toward the elevators with a little more hope than she had carried into the building that morning. She still had no idea that the quiet man who had listened without judgment owned every floor beneath her feet. As the elevator doors closed, Callum Whitaker remained standing in the lobby, watching the numbers climb until the car disappeared from view. Something about Elena's calm honesty stayed with him. It was not dramatic. It was not polished. It was simply real. That was becoming surprisingly rare. His phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen displayed one name. Arthur Whitaker. Callum answered immediately. Dad, how are you feeling? His father's familiar voice carried a tired but cheerful warmth. Much better now. I wanted to thank you for checking on me earlier. The doctor said everything looked fine after the fall. Arthur chuckled softly. I was lucky somebody stopped. Otherwise, I might still be standing beside that muddy ditch arguing with my bicycle. Callum smiled. The hospital mentioned a young woman helped you. Helped me? She practically rescued my pride. Everyone else drove by because they were in a hurry. She climbed right into the mud without thinking twice. Arthur paused before continuing. She even gave me her clean handkerchief because my hands were covered with dirt. Callum looked through the lobby windows toward the gray streets outside. Do you remember her name? No. She never mentioned it. She only kept saying she had an interview downtown and hoped she would not be late. Callum's expression slowly changed. Did she happen to have chestnut hair? Yes. Blue blazer. That sounds right. And muddy shoes? Arthur laughed. Very muddy shoes. A quiet realization settled over Callum. The story Elena had shared inside the interview room had not been simplified to gain sympathy. If anything, she had left out the hardest parts. She never mentioned helping the founder of Whitaker Global. She never hinted that the man she assisted had any connection to the company. She had expected absolutely nothing in return. Dad, Callum said gently, I think I know who she is. Before Arthur could ask another question, Callum promised to visit later that evening and ended the call. At almost the same moment, Monica Voss entered his office carrying the final evaluation folders. She was surprised to find him already reviewing interview notes. I did not realize you planned to observe today's hiring process personally, she said. Callum nodded without looking up. Sometimes numbers do not tell the whole story. Monica placed one folder on his desk. Most candidates performed as expected. One stood out, although perhaps not for the reasons you are thinking. She slid Elena's resume across the desk. A bright yellow note rested on top. Not recommended. Callum read the words twice before lifting his eyes. Explain. Monica spoke with complete confidence. She appears sincere, but judgment matters. She chose to jeopardize an executive interview over a stranger on the side of the road. That suggests emotional decision-making rather than professional discipline. Our clients expect employees who understand priorities. Callum remained silent long enough for the room to become uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, Did anyone verify her explanation? Monica frowned slightly. There was nothing to verify. So we assumed she was telling the truth? Whether it happened or not is not the point. The point is that she arrived looking unprepared. Callum slowly closed the folder. Sometimes preparation begins long before someone enters the building. Monica misunderstood the comment as simple disagreement. There are dozens of equally qualified applicants who arrived looking professional. Callum looked directly at her. And how many of them stopped to help someone when nobody was watching? Monica had no immediate answer. She simply gathered the remaining folders and excused herself, believing the discussion had ended. The moment the office door closed, Callum opened Elena's resume again. Tucked inside was a scanned copy of the recommendation letter, filled with praise about her integrity, work ethic, and ability to remain compassionate under pressure. Beside the document sat a small photograph attached to her application. It showed Elena volunteering at a neighborhood food pantry nearly every Saturday for the past 2 years. There was no mention of it anywhere else in her resume. She had never used it to impress anyone. Callum leaned back in his chair, staring at the city below. For years, he had searched for people with exceptional leadership potential. Today, he was beginning to wonder if he had finally met someone extraordinary, because she had never tried to appear extraordinary at all. The afternoon sky had finally cleared by the time Elena reached the small apartment she rented on the west side of the city. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill still clung to her clothes as she climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. She unlocked the door quietly, hoping not to wake her mother, who had finally fallen asleep after another exhausting medical appointment earlier that morning. The apartment was clean but modest, with faded furniture that had been repaired more times than replaced. A small calendar hanging beside the refrigerator carried circles around 3 dates: rent, utilities, hospital payment. Elena looked at them for a long moment before setting her portfolio gently on the kitchen table. She removed the folded handkerchief from inside and carefully washed the dried mud away under cool running water. As the dirt disappeared, the blue embroidered initials became even clearer. A.W. She smiled softly. "I will find you somehow," she whispered. "People should always get back what belongs to them." She draped the handkerchief across a clean towel to dry, unaware that the simple piece of fabric would soon become far more important than either of them imagined. Across town, Callum Whitaker arrived at his father's historic brownstone carrying takeout from Arthur's favorite neighborhood restaurant. Arthur greeted him with an easy smile that made it difficult to believe he had spent the morning stranded beside a muddy roadside. After they finished dinner, Arthur leaned back in his chair and shook his head with quiet admiration. "I have been thinking about that young woman all day." Callum smiled. "Still?" Arthur nodded. "She reminded me of your mother." Callum's expression softened immediately. Arthur continued, "Not because they looked alike. Because she helped first and explained later. Your mother always believed that kindness should never wait for convenience." The words settled heavily between them. After a moment, Arthur reached into his coat pocket and frowned. "I was wondering where my handkerchief went." Callum looked up. "The one with your initials?" "Yes. It was a gift from your mother years ago. I suppose I left it with that young woman." Callum quietly remembered seeing Elena fold the same handkerchief instead of throwing it away. She had protected something valuable without knowing its story. Arthur laughed gently. "If she kept it, I hope it reminds her that one old man is grateful." Callum looked out the dining room window into the quiet evening. "I have a feeling she would rather return it than keep it." Arthur smiled knowingly. "Then perhaps you should give her the chance." The following morning, Monica Voss began reviewing the official hiring recommendations before sending them to executive approval. Elena's file remained near the bottom of the stack with the words "Not Recommended" highlighted in yellow. Monica believed the decision was final. She never noticed the electronic notification arriving moments later requesting that Elena Marlowe's application be placed on temporary executive review instead of being rejected. The request carried only one authorization code: Chief Executive Office. Meanwhile, Elena spent the morning applying for more positions online from the small public library a few blocks away. Every application felt nearly identical. Upload resume. Answer questions. Wait. Hope. Repeat. She never expected a miracle. She simply refused to stop trying. Around noon, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Her heart skipped as she answered. "Hello, this is Elena Marlowe." A warm, professional voice replied. "Good afternoon, Miss Marlowe. This is Whitaker Global. We would like to invite you back for a brief follow-up meeting." The next morning arrived bright and clear, as though the storm had never happened. Elena Marlowe stood in front of the same glass tower, wearing the only other business outfit she owned. It was simple, carefully pressed, and several years old, but spotless. Before walking inside, she reached into her bag and checked the neatly folded handkerchief one more time. The blue initials, A.W., looked almost new after she had washed and ironed it the night before. She smiled quietly. Maybe today I can finally return you to your owner. The lobby looked just as elegant as it had the previous morning, yet it somehow felt less intimidating. Perhaps nothing had changed except Elena herself. She had already survived the hardest part. Whatever happened today, she knew she had remained true to herself. At the reception desk, the same coordinator greeted her with noticeably warmer eyes. "Good morning, Miss Marlowe. Please take the executive elevator today. Someone will be waiting for you upstairs." Elena thanked her politely, surprised by the unexpected instruction. As the private elevator climbed silently toward the executive floor, she tried to imagine every possible reason for the meeting. Maybe they wanted clarification about her interview. Maybe they had already chosen someone else and simply wished to thank her personally. She refused to build unrealistic expectations. When the doors opened, she found only one person waiting near the windows overlooking the city. It was Cal. He smiled as though he had been expecting her. "Good morning." Elena returned the smile with visible relief. "I am glad to see a familiar face. I thought you might appreciate one." He gestured toward a quiet seating area overlooking the skyline. "Would you mind talking with me for a few minutes before your meeting?" "Not at all." They settled into comfortable chairs with fresh coffee placed on the small table between them. Unlike the previous day, neither of them seemed rushed. The silence felt natural rather than awkward. Callum studied Elena for a moment before speaking. "Did you sleep well?" She laughed softly. "Not really. My imagination worked overtime. Thinking about today, thinking about rent, hospital bills, job applications, and whether I answered every interview question correctly." She smiled at herself. "Mostly everything." Callum admired how easily she admitted uncertainty without losing confidence. "Can I ask another question? You asked good ones yesterday. Go ahead. Why do you keep choosing kindness when life does not seem very kind to you?" Elena looked toward the city below. Cars moved like tiny pieces across the streets, each carrying people with stories nobody else could see. After a thoughtful pause, she answered quietly, "Because I know what it feels like when someone chooses kindness for me." Callum remained silent, encouraging her to continue. "When I was 16, my mother became very sick. We did not have much money back then either. One afternoon, a stranger paid for our groceries after my mother's bank card stopped working. They never gave us their name. They simply smiled and said, 'Someday help somebody else.' I guess I have been trying to repay that debt ever since." Callum felt something shift inside him. She did not help people because life had been easy. She helped because someone had once helped her when everything seemed impossible. There was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude. Elena reached into her bag and carefully placed the folded handkerchief on the table. "Actually, there is something else I wanted to ask." Callum looked at the familiar fabric without reacting. "Yesterday morning, I helped an older gentleman whose bicycle slipped into a muddy ditch. I accidentally kept this afterward. The initials are embroidered on it. I was hoping someone here might know how to find him." Callum gently picked up the handkerchief, running his fingers across the stitched letters. He smiled, remembering his father's words from the night before. "I think I know exactly who it belongs to." Elena's eyes brightened with relief. "Really?" "Yes. Would you please return it for me? It means something to him." I could tell. Callum looked directly into her eyes. "You never thought about keeping it?" Elena appeared genuinely surprised by the question. "It was never mine." At that exact moment, Callum realized the interview had never truly ended. Every conversation since yesterday had revealed another layer of the same remarkable character. She returned what was not hers, even when nobody would have known otherwise. She remembered a stranger while worrying about her own future. She measured success by integrity instead of convenience. Before he could answer, the conference room doors opened at the far end of the hallway, and Monica Voss stepped outside, holding a folder with Elena's name printed across the front. "Miss Marlowe," she called with formal professionalism. "The executive committee is ready to see you now." Elena stood, thanked Cal for the coffee, and followed Monica down the corridor, completely unaware that the greatest surprise waiting inside had nothing to do with the job she believed she was about to discuss. Elena followed Monica Voss through the executive hallway, her heartbeat growing a little faster with every step. The polished wood walls displayed photographs of company milestones, charitable projects, and groundbreaking innovations, yet she barely noticed them. Her thoughts stayed fixed on one question. Was this finally the moment she would learn whether her future had changed or quietly slipped away? Monica opened the conference room door and gestured politely. "Please have a seat, Miss Marlowe. The committee will join you shortly." Elena thanked her and sat alone at the long conference table. Morning sunlight streamed through the massive windows, filling the room with warm light that felt strangely comforting. She rested her hands on the table, reminding herself that no answer could erase the choices she had made. If she had to relive the rainy morning again, she would still stop for the elderly man without hesitation. Outside the room, Monica walked directly toward the executive office where Callum Whitaker was reviewing several reports. She knocked softly before entering. "Everything is ready," she announced. "Miss Marlowe is waiting." Callum looked up. "Thank you." Monica hesitated before continuing. "I still believe this is unnecessary. We have stronger candidates with better corporate experience." Callum closed the report in front of him. "Tell me something, Monica." She waited. If every employee in this company possessed Elena Marlowe's character, would Whitaker Global become weaker or stronger? Monica considered the question carefully. Character matters, of course. Then why does our hiring process reward appearances before character has a chance to speak? Monica lowered her eyes briefly. Because appearances influence clients. Callum stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Chicago. Our clients trust us because of our values. If those values disappear behind polished shoes and expensive suits, then appearances become meaningless. Monica remained silent. She had worked beside Callum for nearly 8 years and rarely saw him speak with such quiet conviction. Before leaving the office, she asked one final question. "Who exactly is she to you?" Callum smiled faintly. "Someone who reminded me what this company was supposed to stand for." Moments later, the conference room door opened again. Elena looked up, expecting the same interview panel from the previous day. Instead, several senior executives entered first, taking their seats with noticeable respect toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Monica stood quietly near the wall. Elena glanced around with growing confusion. Then the final door opened. Cal walked inside wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. His posture remained relaxed, but the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Every executive rose to their feet. Elena watched in complete silence as he walked to the head of the table. Monica spoke first. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." The others echoed the greeting. Elena's eyes widened. She looked from the executives to Cal and back again, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. The friendly employee who had shared coffee with her twice was now standing exactly where the chief executive belonged. Callum met her stunned expression with the same calm smile she already knew. "Please, everyone, have a seat." Elena remained frozen for another moment before slowly lowering herself into the chair. Her mind replayed every conversation they had shared, every simple question, every ordinary smile, every quiet cup of coffee. "You," she whispered almost to herself. "You are the chief executive officer." Callum nodded gently. "Yes, my full name is Callum Whitaker." Embarrassment rushed across Elena's face. "I am so sorry. I had no idea." "That was intentional," he replied kindly. "You treated me exactly the same way you treated everyone else." Elena looked down for a moment, wondering whether she had unknowingly crossed professional boundaries. "If I said anything inappropriate," Callum interrupted with a warm smile. "You told the truth. I have learned that truth is never inappropriate." He reached into his suit pocket and carefully placed the freshly folded handkerchief with the blue embroidered initials onto the table. "Before we discuss anything else, there is someone who asked me to thank you." Elena immediately recognized it. "You found him. He is my father." The room became completely silent. Elena stared at Callum in disbelief. "The gentleman with the bicycle, Arthur Whitaker," Callum said softly. "Founder of this company." Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I did not know." "I know," Callum answered. "That is exactly why this conversation matters." As the executives quietly watched, Callum realized the interview had finally reached the only question that truly mattered, and Elena had already answered it long before she ever stepped into Whitaker Global. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then Monica Voss quietly stood and gathered Elena's application folder. Her professional smile returned, but this time it carried a colder edge. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "before we continue, there is one concern that should be addressed." Callum nodded once. "Go ahead." Monica opened the folder and placed several interview notes on the table. "Considering the circumstances, I believe we should examine whether Miss Marlowe intentionally approached your family before this interview. The timing is unusually convenient." Elena looked up in complete disbelief. "I am sorry," Monica continued without raising her voice. "Yesterday morning you happened to assist the founder of this company. Hours later you appeared in our headquarters. Today you returned carrying his personal handkerchief. From a compliance standpoint, some could interpret that as an attempt to create a personal connection with senior leadership." The room fell silent. Elena's face turned pale, not from fear, but from disappointment. She slowly shook her head. "I did not even know his name until a few minutes ago." Monica calmly slid another page across the table. "Your interview evaluation also notes questionable professional judgment and emotional decision-making under pressure. Based on current hiring policy, I cannot recommend moving forward." Callum glanced at the document. His expression remained calm, but one detail immediately caught his attention. The evaluation in front of him was not the same version he had reviewed the previous evening. Additional remarks had been added after executive review. Without saying a word, he reached for his tablet and quietly opened the original digital interview record. Every timestamp confirmed what he already suspected. The comments criticizing Elena had been inserted only minutes earlier. Elena slowly stood from her chair. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply picked up her portfolio. Looking toward Callum, still believing more in the company than in her own chances, she said softly, "I hope Whitaker Global never becomes a place where kindness needs evidence, but suspicion never does." She offered a respectful nod to everyone in the room before turning toward the door. That single sentence settled over the boardroom more heavily than any accusation ever could. Callum closed his tablet, looked directly at Monica, and quietly said, "Miss Marlowe, please stay. We are not finished yet." Elena looked at the handkerchief resting between them, as though it suddenly carried far more weight than a simple piece of cloth. She slowly reached toward it, but stopped halfway. "I am relieved he is all right," she said softly. "I worried about him after I left." Callum smiled. "My father wanted me to thank you personally. He also said you reminded him of someone very important." Elena lowered her eyes, humbled by the compliment. "Please tell him I only did what anyone should have done." One of the senior executives quietly shifted in his chair. Another exchanged a thoughtful glance with Monica Voss. Everyone in the room understood that very few people actually did stop when it was inconvenient. Callum folded his hands on the table. "Miss Marlowe, yesterday this company evaluated your resume, your interview, and your appearance. Today I would like to evaluate something different." Elena looked up with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I would like to know what kind of company you believe Whitaker Global should become." The question caught several executives by surprise. It was certainly not part of any hiring process they had ever conducted. Elena hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "May I answer honestly?" A faint smile appeared on Callum's face. "That is the only answer I am interested in." Elena drew a slow breath. "When I walked into your lobby yesterday, I understood why people stared. I did not look like someone interviewing for a professional position. I understand first impressions matter. But I also wondered how many good people quietly walked back out of those doors because nobody gave them a chance to explain their story." The room remained completely silent. Elena continued, "A great company should absolutely expect excellence. But I think excellence looks different than perfection. Perfection only notices polished shoes. Excellence notices character, responsibility, and the willingness to do the right thing when nobody is watching." One executive slowly nodded without realizing it. Monica kept her eyes fixed on the table. Elena continued speaking with calm sincerity. "Yesterday, I did not want sympathy because my clothes were dirty. I only wanted the same opportunity every other applicant received. If I was not qualified, I would have accepted that. What frightened me was the possibility that nobody would ever discover whether I was qualified because they stopped looking after the first 5 seconds." Callum listened without interrupting. Every sentence confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. She did not speak from resentment. She spoke from hope. She wanted institutions to become better, not because she expected favors, but because she believed fairness helped everyone. After a thoughtful pause, Callum stood and walked toward the large screen mounted on the conference room wall. With one touch, security footage from the previous morning appeared. The executives watched as Elena entered the lobby covered in mud. They watched applicants laugh. They watched the receptionist hesitate. They watched the security guard approach politely. Finally, they watched Elena answer the question that had remained in Callum's mind ever since. If I had arrived clean because I drove past someone who needed help, I do not think I would deserve this job anyway. Callum turned off the screen. Yesterday I watched this recording 3 times, he said quietly. Not because I wanted to evaluate Miss Marlowe. I wanted to evaluate us. Nobody spoke. Callum looked around the room. Somewhere along the way, we built a company that talks about integrity while allowing assumptions to replace curiosity. His gaze settled briefly on Monica before returning to the group. That is my failure before it is anyone else's. Monica slowly lifted her head. Mr. Whitaker, I made my recommendation based on existing hiring standards. Callum nodded respectfully. I know you did. That is exactly why the standards must change. He picked up Elena's application folder and removed the small handwritten note he had placed inside the previous day. He read the 5 words aloud. Look beyond the first impression. Then he placed the note beside her resume. Beginning today, this principle becomes part of every leadership interview conducted inside Whitaker Global. Several executives immediately began writing notes. Others exchanged thoughtful expressions, realizing they were witnessing the beginning of a cultural change rather than a simple hiring decision. Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had expected either a job offer or a rejection. She never imagined one rainy morning would challenge an entire company's way of thinking. Callum returned to his chair and looked directly at her. Miss Marlowe, your interview has never really been about whether you were right for Whitaker Global. He smiled warmly. It has become a question of whether Whitaker Global is worthy of people like you. The room fell into another thoughtful silence, as every person present realized that the answer to that question would shape far more than a single career. No one spoke for several long seconds. The silence inside the executive conference room no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt meaningful. Elena Marlowe sat quietly, still trying to absorb everything that had happened over the past 2 days. She had walked into Whitaker Global believing she would either leave with a job or another rejection. Instead, she had unknowingly reminded an entire leadership team why the company had existed in the first place. Callum Whitaker slowly stood and looked around the room one final time before returning his attention to Elena. Miss Marlowe, he said warmly. On behalf of Whitaker Global, I would like to apologize for the way your first impression was judged before your character had the opportunity to speak. Elena shook her head gently. You do not owe me an apology. Callum smiled. Perhaps not personally, but as the person responsible for this company, I do. He picked up a blue folder resting beside him and walked around the table until he stood directly across from her. Inside this folder is an offer to join Whitaker Global as a member of our Ethics and Community Impact Division. It is a newly expanded department that will work directly with leadership to strengthen our employee culture, volunteer partnerships, and community outreach programs. I believe your experience, your perspective, and your values belong there. Elena stared at the folder in disbelief before carefully opening it. Her eyes filled with quiet emotion as she read the first page. It was not an entry-level temporary position. It was a full-time role with health benefits, professional development, and a salary that would allow her to care for her mother without constantly wondering which bill had to wait another month. She looked up slowly. Are you sure? Callum nodded without hesitation. Absolutely. Elena smiled through grateful tears she refused to let fall. Then I would be honored to accept. The room filled with genuine applause, not because another position had been filled, but because everyone present understood they had witnessed something much more important than a successful interview. Over the following months, Whitaker Global quietly began changing from the inside out. Interview training was redesigned, so hiring managers evaluated values alongside qualifications. Volunteer service became part of leadership development. Employees were encouraged to share stories of kindness that had shaped their lives rather than only celebrating quarterly numbers. Elena never asked for recognition, but her ideas spread naturally throughout the company, because they reflected something people had been longing for without realizing it. She approached every project with the same humility she had carried into the building on that rainy morning. Several weeks later, Callum invited Elena to join him for lunch at a small neighborhood cafe instead of an expensive downtown restaurant. There were no executives, no formal meetings, and no hidden agenda. They laughed about the first cup of coffee they had shared when she believed he was simply another employee. "You asked an awful lot of questions for someone working in operations," Elena teased with a smile. Callum laughed. "I was trying very hard not to ask too many." Their friendship grew naturally, built on honest conversations rather than impressive titles. Some evenings they volunteered together at the same neighborhood food pantry where Elena had spent countless Saturdays long before Whitaker Global entered her life. Arthur Whitaker often joined them, insisting he still owed Elena far more than a thank you for stopping beside that muddy roadside. Nearly a year after their first meeting, Whitaker Global hosted its annual employee celebration inside the company atrium. Instead of unveiling a new product or financial milestone, Callum announced the creation of a permanent employee recognition program called the First Impression Fellowship. It honored individuals whose quiet acts of integrity had positively changed the lives of others. As the audience applauded, Callum revealed the fellowship's symbol inside a simple glass display at the center of the stage. Resting inside was Arthur Whitaker's handkerchief with the blue embroidered initials AW, carefully preserved beside a small plaque that read, "Character is revealed long before success is recognized." Elena looked at the display and smiled with quiet disbelief. The ordinary handkerchief she had almost thrown away had become a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could change countless lives. Callum turned toward her before everyone gathered there. "The day you walked into this building, many people noticed the mud on your clothes," he said gently. "I am grateful I stayed long enough to notice your heart instead." Elena reached for his hand, smiling with the same quiet sincerity that had first captured his attention. "And I am grateful you chose to look beyond what everyone else could see." Around them, the applause faded into warm conversation, but neither of them seemed to notice. They had both discovered something far more valuable than success. They had found someone who believed that integrity was worth more than appearance, kindness was stronger than judgment, and love was built one honest choice at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to The Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.